Hello everyone, and welcome back to Queen Elizabeth, A Day in Her Life. In the last video, the King and Queen returned to a cheering crowd, and then things turned serious when war was declared. The Duke of Windsor returned, but not to a welcoming family. No one wanted to be near the Duchess of Windsor. King George VI didn't like his brother's attitude. He thought he was selfish, and he still gave no thought to the good of the country. So let's see what happens with them today. On September the 18th, the Queen went back to Scotland to see her daughters. She was worried about them. The Queen had written to Princess Elizabeth that she and the King had seen the Australian rugby team who had arrived, and then they had to go right back home when war was declared the next day. She gave Elizabeth, in the letter, little kangaroo pins that the team had given her to give to the princesses. She wrote, "I'm longing to see you again, my darling. Please give Margaret a big hug from me, and get M to give you a big one from me, as you can't hug yourself very well. Your very loving Mummy." The princesses were enjoying the outdoor life with great weather at Brookhall. The French governess was watching over them. Their cousins Margaret and Diana came to stay, and what made things different were all the evacuees. There were hundreds of them all around from Glasgow. And during the week the Queen spent with her daughters, she went to see some of the evacuees, women and children who had been moved out of the slums to protect them in case of attack on the city. And there were others being cared for on the Balmoral and Abergeldy estate. During the week the Queen spent with her daughters, she went to see some of the evacuees, women and children who had been moved out of the slums to protect them in case of the attack on the city. And there were others being cared for on the Balmoral and Abergeldy estates. Many of them didn't like the country life. The Queen said what frightened them most was the noise of the trees, and a lot of the mothers had taken their children back to Glasgow when the threat of bombardment had not happened, and the Queen disapproved. She wrote to Queen Mary, "I do think that it would be so much better if the wives stayed with their husbands and let the children stay safely in the country." The Queen returned to her husband after a week. Marion Crawford and the princess's French teacher came up to Balmoral, and lessons were resumed, and they joined a weekly sewing party and knitted for the soldiers. Princess Margaret knitted and played the gramophone, Crawford recorded. While the Queen was in Scotland, she visited the Black Watch at their depot at Perth. Among the officers, she suddenly saw her nephew, John Elphinstone. She had never seen him in uniform before. She wrote Queen Mary, "He suddenly looked exactly like my brother Fergus, who was killed at Lewes and in the same regiment." It was uncanny in a way, and desperately sad to feel that all the ghastly waste was starting again at the bidding of a lunatic. In another letter, though, she reflected, was it a waste? Humanity must fight against bad things if we're to survive, and the spiritual things are stronger than anything else and cannot be destroyed, thank God. The Queen, in early wartime task, was to make broadcasts to the women of the Empire. Appeals to her to do so had come from home and abroad. Harold Lansky, a social professor at political science at the London School of Economics, wrote in early September urging the Queen to broadcast a reassuring message to the British mothers whose children had been evacuated. The day of the broadcast was Armistice Day, November 11th, 1939. She began the speech by remembering the meaning of the day, the sacrifices that were made, and to the peace that, after only 20 years, had been broken. She said that I know you would wish me to voice in the name of the women of the Empire our deep and abiding sympathy with those on whom the first cruel and shattering blows have fallen, the women of Poland. Nor do we forget the gallant womanhood of France, who are called on to share with us again the hardships and sorrows of war. She said that in this war the women had real and vital work to do, not only new and interesting duties in various fields of national service, but the 1,001 worries and irritations in carrying on wartime life in ordinary homes. She sympathized with the women separated from their husbands and children. She said her and the King knew what it was like to be separated from their children. She praised the people who had taken in evacuees and assured them, and all those working to keep their homes going, that they were giving real service to the country. She ended by saying, we put our trust in God, who is our refuge and strength in all times of trouble. I pray with all my heart that he may bless and guide and keep you always." The speech was well received not only by the Archbishop, but by the public, by letters. One mother wrote with emotions of how the broadcast had helped her out of her despair when her young son joined the army, leaving her alone and ill. When your quiet words echoed in the room, you seemed to be speaking direct to me, and gradually I saw how much a little home meant, and how important it was to keep on carrying on. I now feel I have a new lead, and know exactly what to do. Without that lead, one little home might have faded out, and if that was the case with one, how many more must have cause to bless and thank you. The Queen was in the busiest period of her life, visiting factories, hospitals, schools, first aid posts, branches of the women's voluntary service, and other workplaces, and talking to as many people as she could. She felt it was important that people be free to tell her anything they liked. The people were settling down to a war they hated, but they were determined to resist aggression. The Queen noticed that the people's cheerfulness showed itself. People were beginning to make jokes about Hitler. The Queen said that it was a rather good sign, for they usually joke about things when they are too serious to be taken seriously, if you know what I mean. Hitler, he's usually known as Old Nasty, and very childish, she wrote to Prince Paul of Yugoslavia. And then Cecil Beaton took pictures of the Queen, and in November 1939, she authorized the publication of a selection of them, and they were greeted with success. Cecil Beaton wrote an account of the audience of which she made her selection. He thought her clothes were ugly and dowdy, and her jewelry messy, but concluded that it did not matter what she wore. Nothing could have detracted from the impression of goodness, sympathy, and overwhelming charm that she conveyed. She looked engagingly wistful, but was businesslike, and she made quietly witty remarks with every breath, and it was humorous, and full of fun, and very shrewd. He thought she was a genius, like a great artist with an infallible instinct and an ability to make an asset. She could get on well with all kinds of people by being genuinely interested in them, and she recognized the excitement that painters or writers feel in their work. She is ideal as Queen of England, for she is the personification of all that is best and a real lady. A painter named Augustus John wanted to paint a picture of the Queen informally. She had purchased several of his paintings before. He wanted to do an informal portrait of the Queen, and she agreed. She started sitting for him in December. She wore an evening dress with a tiara rather than a day dress that he had suggested. He found her a perfect sitter. She never asked questions and talks of all sorts of interesting things. The Queen said she loved sitting for A. John. He was such fun and never drew breath except when the Griller Quartet came and played next door and put him off completely. He said rightly that he couldn't possibly listen and paint. The painting was never actually finished, but the Queen was delighted when in 1961 she was presented the work, and she wrote to tell the artist so. It hung in her drawing room for the rest of her life. At the same time, the King and Queen were both having more formal state portraits painted by Gerald Kelly, a distinguished portraitist, and later president of the Royal Academy. He was asked to move into the Windsor Castle when the war broke out until he finished his work, and he gratefully accepted. The royal family were surprised that the artist ended up living for much of the war with them at the castle. Fortunately, he was witty and entertaining. It was thought that he would go to the studio in the dead of night to erase the previous day's work in order to stay longer. The paintings were finally ready to go on show after the war in 1945. Kelly was given a knighthood, and the band played "Anybody Here Seen Kelly?" And the King and Queen and everyone else was surprised that once Hitler's Polish campaign was over, the first 6 months became quiet. The so-called Phony War lasted through the winter until the spring of 1940. The Allies did very few offensive operations on the ground and more in the air. At sea, the Battle of the Atlantic began. Allied convoys bridging vital supplies from North America were so devastated by the German Navy that Britain's survival was threatened. At the end of November, the first wartime parliament ceremony was abandoned, and instead of parliamentary robes, the king wore a naval uniform, and the Queen was dressed against the cold in velvet and furs, embellished with pearls. Chips Channon thought she had never looked so regal and beautiful. The king held the Queen's hand as he walked slowly out of the chamber. In the first week of December, the king went to visit the British Expeditionary Force in France. The king's trip was good for morale. Colonel Piers Lay, the king's equerry, wrote the Queen that his visit, although strenuous and uncomfortable, was an inspiration in itself for the soldiers, and the king showed a vital interest and understanding of the difficulties and problems which confront the highest and lowest of all ranks of the BEF. and one member of the force put it strongly, "We feel ready for any number of Hitlers now." That year, the king made his famous Christmas broadcast. The king thought it was up to him to stop the apathy that the stalemate of the Phony War had brought on. He said that there were dark days ahead of them. The king said, "A new year is at hand. We cannot tell what it will bring. If it brings peace, how thankful we shall all be. If it brings us continued struggle, we shall remain undaunted. In the meantime, I feel that we may all find a message of encouragement in the lines which, in my closing words, I would like to say to you. I said to the man who stood at the gate of the year, 'Give me a light that I may tread safely into the unknown.' And he replied, 'Go out into the darkness and put your hand into the hand of God. That shall be you, better than light and safer than a known way. May that almighty hand guide and uphold us all.'" Once the speech was over, the king and his family could relax and enjoy a quiet holiday at Sandringham. The princesses came from Birk Hall on December 20th, and it was a joyous reunion. The king hadn't seen his daughters for 4 months. The queen loved having her children back. She wrote to Queen Mary that they do help one forget that ever-present worries and troubles of these horrible days. She also said that on Boxing Day, while they were out with the shooting party, 3 large bombers came over very low. The children were thrilled because they thought they saw black swastikas on the wings. However, I think they proved to be our own aircraft. The king and queen decided that the girls shouldn't go back to Scotland after Christmas, but stay at Royal Lodge. Birk Hall, according to the king, was too far off, and at their age, their education is too important to be neglected. Well, the Phony War came to an end April the 9th, when Adolf Hitler swooped on Denmark and attacked Norway. Norway resisted and declared war on Germany. Britain promised all the help in her power, but the British naval expeditionary forces weren't able to protect their ally against the coordinated German assault. By May 4th, almost all of Norway was in German hands. This was a stunning defeat. There was a pent-up frustration with the government and its lackluster performance. It was clear that Neville Chamberlain could not be a war leader. He was a man of peace, and he hated making any decision that might cause casualties on either side. He was right to fear Britain's army. It was only 2 years old, not well trained enough to take on the Wehrmacht, and the king and queen were still loyal to Chamberlain, so they weren't too happy that everyone wanted to get rid of him. On May 10th, Hitler's troops poured into Holland, Belgium, Luxembourg, and France. Chamberlain wanted to remain as prime minister at the head of a national government, but the Labour Party refused to serve under him, and that afternoon he went to Buckingham Palace to offer his resignation. Chamberlain recommended that the king send for Churchill. The king did it. After meeting with Churchill, the king wrote in his diary, he was full of fire and determination to carry out the duties of prime minister. And the queen wrote Chamberlain a warm letter. "I can never tell you in words how much we owe you. During these last desperate and unhappy years, you have been a great support and comfort to us both, and we felt so safe with the knowledge that your wisdom and high purpose were there at our hand. Although one knew that carnage had to come, it is hard to sit here and think of those splendid men being sacrificed to Hitler. You did all you could to stave off such agony, and you were right." The queen never changed her mind about Chamberlain. Asked many years later if history had been unkind to him, she said, "Yes, I think he was a good man. I think he really tried, and whatever people say, it gave us that year, because as usual, they had practically got rid of the army, so that gave us 1 year to rearm and build a few airplanes." Queen Mary wrote to the king to commiserate on the loss of Chamberlain, a prime minister in whom he had confidence and were able to talk to as a friend, whereas Winston is so uncertain. Let us hope and pray all may be for the best in the end. So I'm going to stop the video here. The king and queen had a deal in suspense as there was what was known as the Phony War. It was a period of World War II between September 1939 and April 1940 when there was a little fighting. Then the war officially broke out when Germany invaded Norway. The king and queen were busy trying to keep morale up in the country, and before the war broke out, the king and queen had portraits done of them, and they were each given out radio broadcasts. It sounded like a time of anxiety, wondering when the shoe would drop, and then it did, and things would get rough. So I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you did, if you could give it a thumbs up, it would really help out my channel. I appreciate all of you giving your words of encouragement and saying how much you enjoy the Queen Mother videos. It's been really neat to find out so much about her life. She sounded like a really remarkable woman. So I wish everybody a good day, and tune in again soon for another episode of Queen Elizabeth, A Day in Her Life. Thank you. Bye.